Eleanor Hayes had worked as a housemaid at Ashcombe Hall for 3 years. In all that time, Duchess Margaret Ashcombe had never once bothered to learn her name. To the Duchess, she was simply the girl. She dusted the mantels, pressed the linens, and vanished quietly whenever guests arrived. Eleanor did not mind being invisible. In truth, she preferred it that way. She had her own reasons for keeping her head down and her past locked away, where no one could reach it. Ashcombe Hall stood on a hill above the village, its gray stone walls covered in ivy that had grown wild over generations. The family who lived there was old and proud, their name known across the county for wealth that had lasted through centuries. Eleanor had grown up in a small cottage not far from the estate, raised by her grandmother after her parents died when she was very young. Her grandmother, Rose, had never spoken much about her own past. She worked hard, kept a modest home, and raised Eleanor with quiet love. The only thing she left behind when she passed was a small wooden box, and inside it, a ring. It was a sapphire ring, deep blue and old, surrounded by tiny diamonds set in gold that had softened with age. Eleanor wore it every day since her grandmother's passing 2 years ago. It was the only piece of her family she had left, and she treasured it more than anything else in the world. She had taken the job at Ashcombe Hall because the wages were steady, and the work, though tiring, was honest. She never imagined that a piece of jewelry she wore for comfort would one day turn her whole world upside down. It happened during the autumn gala, an evening when the halls of Ashcombe were filled with music, laughter, and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. The staff worked quickly behind the scenes, carrying trays, polishing silver, and making sure every candle stayed lit. Eleanor had been assigned to the east wing, far from the guests, cleaning an old set of candelabras that had been pulled from storage for the occasion. She was so focused on her work that she did not hear the footsteps approaching until it was too late. Duchess Margaret swept into the room, trailed by a small group of guests who had wandered away from the main hall in search of something interesting to gossip about. The Duchess stopped suddenly, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Eleanor's hand resting against the candelabra. The light from the chandelier above caught the sapphire on her finger, and it sparkled unmistakably. "Where did you get that?" the Duchess demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a blade. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding. She lowered her hand instinctively, though it was already too late to hide the ring. "It was my grandmother's, Your Grace," she said softly. The Duchess let out a short, sharp laugh, one that held no warmth at all. "A servant girl, wearing a ring like that? Don't be ridiculous. That ring is far too fine for someone like you. You must have stolen it, or worse, someone gave it to you in exchange for something improper. Either way, you are a nobody, pretending to be someone you are not. Take it off before I have you removed from this house." The guests behind her murmured among themselves, some looking amused, others uncomfortable. Eleanor felt her face burn with humiliation, but something in her refused to bow completely. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, gentle but firm. "Never let anyone make you feel small for holding on to what is truly yours." "It was given to me," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. "I won't take it off." The Duchess's eyes widened at the girl's defiance. She opened her mouth to speak again, sharper this time, but a new voice interrupted before she could. "What is going on here?" Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe had just returned from London that afternoon, and had planned to slip quietly into the gala without much fuss. Instead, he found himself walking into the middle of a scene that made the hair on his arms rise. He looked at his mother, then at the young maid standing near the candelabras, her hand still raised slightly, the ring catching the light. He went very still. "That ring," he said slowly, stepping closer, "belonged to my great-grandmother. It has been missing for nearly 40 years. My father searched for it for most of his life and never found it." The room fell into a heavy silence. Even the Duchess seemed startled into quiet for a moment. Eleanor lifted her chin, though her hands were shaking. "My grandmother's name was Rose," she said. "She worked here once, a very long time ago. She never told me much about her time here, only that a woman who cared for her deeply gave her this ring before she left. She always said that one day, it would matter who I truly was." Nathaniel stepped even closer, his eyes moving between the ring and Eleanor's face. Something about her eyes, the particular shade of gray, struck him as familiar, though he could not immediately place why. He asked the guests, gently but firmly, to return to the main hall, and once the room had emptied, he turned back to Eleanor. "Please," he said, "sit down. I want to understand this properly." Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the door where the Duchess still stood, arms crossed, clearly displeased, but unwilling to argue further in front of her son. Eleanor sat on the edge of a chair near the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Over the next several days, Nathaniel could not stop thinking about what had happened. He found himself drawn to the estate's old records room, a dusty corner of the house filled with ledgers, letters, and portraits collected over generations. He remembered a story his grandmother had once told him, half in secret, about a young housemaid who had left Ashcombe Hall suddenly, decades before he was born. No one ever spoke of her again. It had always been treated as a small, forgotten scandal, the kind families quietly bury and never revisit. He pulled out an old portrait of his great-grandmother, the previous Duchess, painted when she was still a young woman. Beside her in the painting stood a housemaid, her expression calm and steady. Nathaniel studied the maid's eyes for a long moment. They were the same shade of gray he had seen in Eleanor's eyes just days before. He brought the portrait, along with a stack of old letters he found tucked behind it, to Eleanor the next morning. She read through them slowly, her hands trembling, as the truth began to take shape before her. The letters revealed a story that had been hidden for generations. Rose, Eleanor's grandmother, had once worked at Ashcombe Hall as a young woman. During that time, she had fallen in love with the Duke's son, a young man who would have inherited the title had circumstances been different. When Rose discovered she was carrying his child, she knew the truth could destroy both of their families. The old Duchess, Nathaniel's great-grandmother, had learned of the situation and made a difficult choice. Rather than see Rose and her child cast out with nothing, shamed and abandoned, she quietly arranged for Rose to leave the estate with dignity. She pressed the family's sapphire ring into Rose's hands as a token of protection and love, a secret promise that the truth would matter someday, even if it could not be spoken aloud at the time. Eleanor was not simply a maid working at Ashcombe Hall. She was the great-granddaughter of a duke, her family line quietly erased by decades of silence and fear of scandal. When Nathaniel shared this discovery with his mother, the Duchess refused to believe it at first. She dismissed the letters as forgeries and the portrait as coincidence. She could not accept that the same family blood that ran through her son also ran through the maid she had humiliated in front of her guests. But as more evidence came to light, including old birth records and letters written in Rose's own hand, even the Duchess could no longer deny the truth. For Eleanor, the revelation was overwhelming. She had spent her whole life believing she was simply the granddaughter of a hard-working, quiet woman. Now she learned that her family's history was tangled with wealth, love, sacrifice, and secrecy far beyond anything she had imagined. She did not know how to feel. Part of her was angry that so much had been hidden, that her grandmother had lived and died without ever speaking her whole truth. Another part of her felt a strange, quiet peace, as if pieces of herself that had always felt slightly out of place were finally settling into position. Nathaniel, for his part, found himself changed by the discovery as well. He had grown up surrounded by wealth and expectation, taught from a young age to value titles, appearances, and family reputation above almost everything else. Watching his mother's cruelty toward Eleanor, and then learning the truth of her identity, forced him to question values he had never thought to challenge before. He began spending more time with Eleanor, not out of obligation, but out of genuine curiosity and care. He wanted to know her, not as a long-lost relative or a symbol of a family secret, but simply as herself. Slowly, over the weeks that followed, something gentle grew between them. Eleanor was hesitant at first, unsure whether Nathaniel's kindness was born from guilt or something more sincere. She had spent years being overlooked, and she was not eager to be pulled into a world that had once dismissed her so easily. But Nathaniel was patient. He listened when she spoke about her grandmother, about the small cottage where she grew up, about the quiet, steady love that had shaped her, despite having so little. He admired her strength, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, even after being humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. Duchess Margaret struggled the most with the change. She had built much of her identity around the family name and the idea that blood and title determined worth. Watching her son grow close to the very girl she had once called a nobody was difficult for her to accept. But as the days passed and she was forced to reckon with the truth of what her own family had done generations ago, hiding Rose away out of fear of scandal, she began to see her cruelty toward Eleanor in a new light. It was not really about Eleanor at all. It was about a fear the family had carried for decades, fear of losing status, fear of the truth becoming known. Slowly, painfully, the Duchess began to soften, though it took much longer than anyone expected. Eleanor was never interested in titles or fortune. She had grown up without either, and had built a life on hard work and quiet resilience. What she wanted, more than anything, was simply to be seen and respected for who she truly was, not dismissed because of her position, or judged because of assumptions made about her. Nathaniel gave her that. He did not try to change her, or mold her into someone else's idea of what a duke's relative should be. He simply saw her, fully and honestly, and valued her exactly as she was. As the months passed, whispers about the story spread quietly through the county, though Nathaniel and Eleanor did their best to keep the details private, respecting Rose's memory and the difficult choices she had made so long ago. Eleanor eventually chose to stay at Ashcombe Hall, not as a housemaid, but as herself, slowly stepping into a role that felt honest rather than assigned. She did not seek to erase her past as a maid. Instead, she carried it with her, a reminder of the strength it had taken to survive, and the humility she never wanted to lose. The sapphire ring, once a symbol of shame and secrecy, became something entirely different. It stood now as proof that truth, no matter how long it is buried, has a way of finding its way back into the light. It reminded everyone who knew its story that worth is never determined by position or judgment, but by the quiet courage it takes to hold on to what is true, even when the whole world tries to convince you otherwise. Duchess Margaret, in time, offered Eleanor a quiet apology, one that came not with grand words, but with small gestures of respect that grew more genuine as time went on. It was not a perfect resolution, but it was real, and for Eleanor, that was enough. Nathaniel and Eleanor's bond deepened into something steady and true, built not on titles or expectations, but on honesty, patience, and mutual respect. Eleanor often thought of her grandmother during quiet moments at the estate, wondering if Rose had ever imagined her granddaughter would one day walk these same halls, no longer hidden, no longer dismissed, but finally, fully seen. In the end, the story of the lost sapphire ring was not really about wealth or family lines at all. It was about the quiet strength it takes to remain true to yourself, even when others try to tell you that you are nothing. It was about the way love, even when hidden for decades, can still find a way to surface and heal what was once broken. And it was about Eleanor, a girl once called a nobody, who proved through her quiet dignity that she had been somebody all along.